aviation sector. And so one of the questions is, how did it change the aviation sector? Are there new sorts of clients? Are there new business models which are coming up? So this is a question I would like to ask to Yvonne.
Bonjour tout le monde. Je vais continuer en anglais parce que je parle anglais beaucoup mieux que le français. Well, this landscape has definitely changed. As we know, the pandemic impacted the aviation sector in a major way. African airlines even more. We basically had to rebuild again. There's more emphasis on cost control for a lot of airlines, given what happened. We are seeing higher yields now, less passengers, but higher yields because there's been a major capacity constraint as well. The good news is most airlines are recovering. We went through a period where we saw a lot of airlines going under. So the continent, which is already underserved, became more underserved. And we've all experienced that just coming here. Most of us had to go to Europe to come down to Casablanca. So the connections, again, became even worse. But we are seeing strong recovery. Most airlines are at 80% of pre-pandemic levels. Last year, with a bit of stability, we did see a lot of recovery, and we hope by the end of this year, early next year, we're back to pre-pandemic levels. In terms of profiles of passengers, I think what we're seeing now is more discerning passengers. People want to know what's going to happen. After years, the last 3 years of uncertainty, people want to know, they want information at their fingertips to know, is this flight on time? If it's disrupted, what's going to happen? People are more discerning now. They don't want that uncertainty anymore. So for most airlines, I think that's where automation will come in handy in terms of delivering up-to-the-minute information to our passengers. But it's positive. We know the continent is still underserved. There's a lot of potential. So we are going to see a lot of partnerships between airlines, whether it's between African airlines and international players as well, in order to close some of these gaps as well. So I think it'll be interesting to watch what happens in the coming months.
Poppy, would you like to add something? How is the situation in South Africa after the pandemic?
So thank you very much, and greetings to the panel, the ministers here present. Quite delighted to be in Casablanca in Morocco for the first time, and such a beautiful country, and thank you so much for the hospitality. So on the question about how the crisis has changed the landscape, I think not only from a South African perspective, but I think from an African continent perspective, is that the pandemic really brought to the surface the glaring gaps that existed in the system as we knew it. The issues of air connectivity, for instance, we couldn't get vaccines from one region to another, and it was a huge challenge for the African countries in particular, and that is because of the air connectivity issues. And it's quite exciting to see how, through the African Civil Aviation Commission, the African continent is now repositioning itself in terms of ensuring, one, that air connectivity is in fact improved through the SATM project, which is led by the African Civil Aviation Commission, but the issues of accessibility as well, because in our continent, to fly to Casablanca, Morocco, I had to go via Middle East, Doha, and I think some of us here in the panel had to go via Europe and so on. It's not that these are the challenges that we didn't know about, but I think the pandemic has just reaffirmed the gaps that perhaps we glossed over and never really paid attention to to say it's high time that we begin to have meaningful conversations and not just discussions that make us feel good and happy, but action-orientated conversations. And we, as South Africa, we are really putting all efforts behind the African Civil Aviation Commission in order to get the SATM up and running. So I think we're one of the countries who've signed up for the pilot project, because we do believe that we have such a diverse continent with so much to offer. But if you were to look at how many people, or what is the percentage of people who are using air travel for trade, for tourism, and so on, so we have not even scratched the surface. So there's a lot that we need to do as a continent to improve air connectivity, and therein lies the new customer. Because maybe for the longest time, we've always treated civil aviation as an elite mode of transportation, which only the people who can afford can use it. But I think we have now been challenged in a great way to think and reset beyond the pandemic, and to say, who is this customer that we've been neglecting for the longest time? What kind of new business models from a cargo perspective? We saw how cargo played a pivotal role in terms of the movement of the protective, medicinal, the healthcare, what do we call it, PPEs, the vaccines, and so on. So I think from a cargo perspective, there is a new model that has really emerged in terms of efficiencies and making sure that, in fact, there is a broader coverage to access. Healthcare system, I think, was one of the biggest challenges during the COVID. But therein lies different new opportunities in terms of how do we build this market such that it gives us, the connectivity and the accessibility that we will require as a continent. We are a continent with more than 53 countries, just 54. About 54. Yeah, 54 countries. And if you were just to think about, and they call Africa a sleeping giant, and we just need to shake it up and let it must wake up as quickly as possible. And the resources are here. We've got, I think, a lot, but I think perhaps collaboration, we're not coordinated the way that we should. But it's quite exciting that we have a vibrant lady here, Secretary General of AFCEC, who's really trying to push. And I think as African countries, we need to put rally behind AFCEC and make sure that we give the much needed support to ensure that this is an agency that enables air connectivity, in particular in the continent. Thank you.
Okay. You already addressed the single African air transport market, SNRTnews. So I would like to ask Ade Funke, who's responsible for this project, if I understood it right. How did the crisis affect the plans for it and the plans for a single African sky as well?
Great, thank you very much. Sabah here, bonjour à tous, good morning everyone. This is my 4th time in Morocco in the 4 months that I've taken office as the African Civil Aviation Commission Secretary General. So it just goes to show how much I love the country. And I have to say, just very quickly, how proud I am as an African to be in Morocco after what we did during the World Cup. Yeah, I'm a football fan. All right, so the Single African Air Transport Market is one of those initiatives that can really transform the continent of Africa in fundamentally important ways. And during the crisis, I remember a day when I was looking at Flight Radar 24, for those of us who look at some of these aviation tools. And it was, I think, the middle of the crisis. And there was hardly any flights over Africa because all the borders were closed. There was only few flights, and I think that was mainly some of the carriers that were moving the aid, medicines and the PPEs across the continent. There was hardly any flying. And I looked at Europe, I looked at North America, I could see that there was still quite a lot of flights happening. And that is the difference, and that's the opportunity that I saw at that moment. That in Europe, that has 28 countries, because they have a liberalized market that in essence is a domestic market, they were still able to move their people, their goods and services around during the pandemic. Whereas in Africa, with the 54 countries that are not homogeneous, because we didn't have the same, we were not able to do that. And that really, really impacted lives, livelihoods, economies, industries, people. So what is really important about the SATAM? It's critical that we can do that. And COVID brought not just, flying across Africa, but also the initiatives to fast-track SATAM to a halt. So since then, we've started looking at how we can accelerate and fast-track SATAM. And let me just give a few numbers. In 2019, Europe flew about 1.1 billion passengers. The Middle East, about 230 or so million passengers. Latin America, about 305 million passengers. Africa, with 1.4 billion people, flew just over 100 million, meaning a tenth of our population, 1/10 of our population flies by air. Meanwhile, in all the other regions I've mentioned, air transport is mass transportation. It's commuter transportation. So people who go to work fly. Whereas in Africa, as mentioned by DG of South Africa, aviation is seen as an elite industry. So we've got to change that. And how do we do that? Like I mentioned, we have to accelerate the liberalization of the African air transport market. And it's really important to do that for several reasons. One is that it has already been proven that aviation is a catalyst for socio-economic development and enablement of, industries, investment, innovation, creativity. So Africa also needs to benefit from that. The other is that there are connections today. So there are flights. As the Honorable Minister mentioned before, we're back. Yes, there are flights. But what we see in Africa is that the flights are mainly within the regions. So North Africa is quite well connected to the countries within the region. South Africa, or Southern Africa, also quite connected within the region. East Africa, quite connected. West Africa, the least connected. The most landlocked, so many countries in there, they don't have a coastline. The only way to get services to them by air many times. Otherwise, they have to wait for months or years to get supplies. So the issue is how to ensure that we can connect the continent much better. And we can get these regions to interconnect as well, so to cross. So one of the ways that we're thinking about doing that is clustering countries in Africa. There's 54 countries. It's not possible for all of the countries to connect at the same time. So what we're doing is we're breaking it up into small pieces, clusters of countries, seeing how we can cluster countries from north, east, south, and how can you connect amongst yourself. And the other way, west, north, east, and so on. That's what we're trying to do now. We've already started with our initial clusters, South Africa being one of them, Kenya being one of them, and of course Morocco. Morocco has quite a number of fifth freedom routes. Now what do I mean by fifth freedom? You go from one city to another. That's a point to a point. But then you go from one city to another and then to another. That's the fifth freedom. So what we want to see happening is states facilitating the market access for that to happen, and then the airlines cooperating to do that. And so fifth freedom will help the market to grow and will connect the continent better because it allows the airlines to extend existing capacity to multiple intercontinental destinations on one marketed flight. That's just the simple thing. So we know that capacity of aircraft is a constraint, but it's really important to do that. So our job is to ensure that we engage our states and we engage the industry to make that happen by working with the states to create an enabling environment to do so. And as we grow the market, the airspace also has to be taken into consideration. We've got to ensure that we are also maximizing the capacity of the airspace in that way. And I just want to make a final comment based on the point from the space astronaut. Yes, you know, it's really amazing. I remember many, many years ago, I went to South Africa, a city called Margate. Has a very small airport, so only turboprops, propeller planes can land. That morning, I was particularly fortunate. I was looking outside the window as we were landing, and there was a group of young girls standing at the fence. They were holding the fence, looking at the plane landing and looking at what was happening in the airfield. So when I came out, I went to meet them. So their teacher had brought them, an all-girls school, had brought them to, it was like a school field trip, had brought them to see the planes. This was many years ago. And I made friends with the teacher and by extension with some of the students. You know, one of those students is now doing a master's in aerospace engineering in the University of Florida. And it is that power to dream. And that's the message I want to say mainly about why aviation is so important. Not is it just the modern connector of the world. And we saw that a lot during COVID. While technology, the second superconnector, really helped the world keep together, but nothing can replace these physical connections. So it's really important for us to harness that, and really important to harness that for Africa. So the market remains untapped for Africa, for us to be able to really explore this potential. And when I heard the minister mentioning that we're manufacturing in Morocco, we're manufacturing parts, that's fantastic. Because as we engage with states and we move forward, we can then let them know that, you know, Morocco, your brother, is manufacturing parts. So you don't have to go all the way to X, Y, and Z with the cost and the expense to do that. Yvonne was telling me, both of us were looking and saying, this is amazing. It can do some transformative things for her airline, as it can do for many others here. And so we encourage our governments to really get on board, to really embrace the SATAM, and to not be afraid. Let us open up to each other. Just as football united Africa, so can aviation.
But at the same time, since the crisis, there are a lot of more efforts asked for decarbonization and for environmental sustainability is becoming more and more important. So how do you think is the aviation sector in all prepared for this? I think, Yannick, you are a specialist for this question.
Thank you, Geshe. Good morning to everyone. Thank you for the warm welcome to Casablanca. Yes, and like many trends that we see in the air transport industry, decarbonization existed prior to the crisis. The pandemic just put focus, and when I hear you ladies, probably more in Western countries than it does in Africa, clearly because we see traffic coming back, but eventually being capped by the sustainability issues at a point. Although today, to tell you the truth, there's many speech about that, but in actual fact, we are not seeing it in the traffic yet, despite, by the way, and maybe we'll touch on it, despite the increase of ticket price of fares, which have increased, I would say worldwide, but if I gave European numbers, 25 to 30% increase in the fares. So we are not seeing right now neither the fare increase nor the sustainability question capping in any ways the air traffic. Nonetheless, a lot of speech about it. As I said, a pre-COVID trend, and by the way, the industry has always worked on reducing the fuel footprint of aviation for one single reason for 50 years, which was the cost of fuel, which account for 20 to 30% of your cost in an airline. And therefore, we've always aimed at decreasing that fuel consumption, and it decreased in the last 50 years by sixfold per passenger on average. So the fleet has increased, has improved tremendously, and we did that mainly through technology. Better aerodynamics for the plane, less weight, and improve engine design to consume less fuel. Now we are doing it to save the planet, and I think it's a valid goal. The planet is in crisis, the planet is warming, and we need to continue that trend clearly to cap the temperature increase of the planet. There are three main areas in which we need to act. One is to continue to improve the airplane, and we have a panel this afternoon where we will detail more what the engine makers are doing, what the airplane makers are doing towards that trend of increasing the aerodynamics, increasing the engine design, and continue to lighten all equipment, structures that goes into an airplane. And it's a fight that would give us, at least in the foreseeable future, 30% improvement versus the latest technology of airplane, namely the 737 MAX or the A320neo or the 787 or the A350. But with that reference, we can probably gain 30% more through technology. The other thing that is probably more available immediately is improving the operation. Clearly, there's a lot of fuel consumption that are due to poor operation, and here I'm talking about constant ascent, constant descent, and progressive descent, point-to-point flight, etc., that could gain up to 10% fuel consumption, especially for short-haul flights, which are the one on which those lack of good operation costs more in terms of percentage of fuel consumption. And then the third level that we have our new fuel, what we call sustainable aviation fuel, and I'm sure all of you have heard of that acronym already, SAF. So there are two generations of SAF. One which is the one which is used today for the one that are available, and I know there's only 1% of the overall worldwide fuel consumption for airplane that can be covered by SAF as we speak today, which is very, very little, and as a consequence, expensive. And I'm sure the airlines will say that. There is a second generation of fuel, which are the synthetic fuel, which are made from hydrogen and CO2, carbon dioxide. To make a sustainable aviation fuel, a synthetic fuel, you need green hydrogen. And to make green hydrogen, you need to crack water, and to crack water, you need electricity. And I think this is a tremendous opportunity for the African countries to provide green electricity from solar energy. You have plenty of available land, plenty of suns, and therefore you could become in the next 20, 30 years, if you wanted to, and if you are able to attract investment in Africa, but you have the basic resource to be able and to become a major provider of synthetic fuel in the future. So I really think, and again, it's not short-term, but probably mid-term, that we can all together achieve that. I will remind everybody of the ICAO commitment, which is to be net zero by 2050. And to that purpose, we need to be able to manufacture 500,000 million of tons of e-fuel by 2050. So it's a huge number, and it will require a lot of investment.
At the other hand, before when we were preparing the panel, I talked to Yvonne about the SAF and the plans of the European Commission to make it mandatory to implement 2% of SAF for planes taking off from airports in Europe in 2025. And if it's fair or unfair, because there's not enough SAF at the moment. So we talked about it. So what's your point of view? Is it an opportunity for Africa, or is it the SAF?
I think it's a very controversial one. But all airlines, including African airlines, have signed on to the net zero by 2050. And we do understand that in order to get to that target, the fastest way is through using the use of SAF. But especially for African airlines, we have two issues. The cost, which you've mentioned. Already jet fuel, kerosene is much more expensive in the African continent than anywhere else. We're paying close to 50% higher prices. Now, SAF is even more expensive than that. So how are African airlines expected to remain commercially viable when you have to pay such a huge premium when you're using for fuel, which accounts for some of us, it's 35–40% of our operating expenses. So that's the dilemma right now. And the second one is availability. For the target of 2025 for some European markets, where are we going to get the fuel within the continent? Yes, we might be able to pick it up in Heathrow or wherever, but what happens on the outbound journey as well from the continent? So it's a bit of a dilemma, and I think we need to, airlines, governments, OEMs have to work together to see how to address this issue as quickly as possible. But it's a dilemma for a lot of airlines, especially African airlines. So I think, to your question, it's a bit unfair to expect in 2 years for us to uplift SAF. But that's where we should be headed. But we need to work closely together to see how to make it more accessible and more affordable.
Maybe we could take as an example what the United States are doing, because I think it's a great example of incentive both for airlines to use SAF and for people to invest into the manufacturing of SAF, which is the incentive in terms of tax break that they are getting if they use SAF at the airline, and the co-investment that the government is doing for the investor that invest in SAF manufacturing. And it's not minor, it's 30 to 50% of contribution from the US federal government for the use of SAF for the airlines. So since we have a governmental representative, I really think that indeed you're absolutely right. It will not happen just the airline doing it. It needs everybody cooperation, and the government among all the stakeholders of the development of aviation have a great role to play, I think.
And are there any similar plans in Africa to make it mandatory as well, to take SAF?
Yeah, I think let's remember that Africa represents just about 2% of international traffic. And so I would say that it's a really far, it's going to be really far away before there's any kind of mandatory rule made about the use of SAF. And for all the reasons that Yvonne mentioned, but also to add that in terms of SAF opportunity, most of it according to all the science and all the analysis, is going to be on the continent of Africa.
Absolutely.
But then what does that then mean for Africa itself? And so what we've seen traditionally before with fossil fuels, for example, is quite, the legacy of a bit of exploitation. But we have an opportunity with with SAF, to actually jointly develop projects. So not just the investment that comes in, we want the investment quite all right, but we also want the opportunity to capacitate the Africans with these projects right from the get-go, right from the beginning, so that it really then becomes a source of job creation, knowledge transfer, technical capacity, and so on and so forth. And this is what we asked for as Africa during the ICAO Assembly. And this was what we put to the world to say on self-development, we join the world and commit to it, even though Africa is really vulnerable to climate change, but Africa was proactive and joined and committed to it. But said, the caveat that we have to work together and support each other in doing this right from the beginning so that it really does become that opportunity that it can be. And I think Poppy can also speak to the issue of SAF and COSIA based on her presidency of the ICAO Assembly.
I think that has now been well covered.
Yes.
But I think maybe as a parting shot is to say climate change is not a country-specific problem. It's not a regional-specific or continental-specific problem. It's a global problem. And it is extremely important, consistent with the spirit of No Country Left Behind, advocated by the International Civil Aviation Organization, that those with the know-how handhold those that lack in terms of knowledge and so on. Because it's one thing to get it right in Europe only, but you don't get it right in the other continents. So I think there is even a bigger discussion that we must continue to have beyond the aspirational goals and the commitments that we made in the previous assembly, but there is a journey that we must traverse together as a collective and maybe just break down the barriers, continental barriers, but to look at this as a global challenge which must be tackled. I think that spirit that we built in the previous assembly, it must resonate as we forge ahead with the journey in terms of curbing the climate change issues.
I think we are everybody would sign that we have to join efforts and to make it a global effort and not only for our continent. During the crisis or after the crisis, now there are other problems which are popping up, which are really for the aviation industry very important. It's the tension of the supply chain, the availability of the aircrafts and shortage of flight delays. Yes, how would you, I see this as a question for Yannick and for Yvonne as well. How do you handle the situation?
Clearly today, the aviation industry, the aerospace industry, has become again an offer industry and not a demand industry, meaning we are not able to manufacture the number of planes that the industry and the air transport is requiring. It's a fact. We all face that. So, and the main reason for it is the supply chain crisis. It started during the COVID with the electronic component crisis. And the explanation behind it is rather rational, which is the huge increase in consumer electronics that the world needed when we were all closed up at home and working from home. So clearly it drove a huge increase of component demand, and therefore the industry, the rest of the industry, got trapped, and when we restarted, clearly we could not get them. And as an electronic manufacturer, as Thales, we were really badly hit, and it's a worldwide trend. My colleague in Honeywell and in Collins in the United States faced the same challenges, and it started with the electronic component crisis. Then the Russian-Ukraine war started, and there's a lot of component that comes from that region, metal, as you know, the titanium challenge, and it's not the mineral, the titanium mineral that is lacking, is the forging of that mineral to make spar for us to use in the airplane. This is that industry that is vastly located in Russia that is lacking, and that we are trying collectively from the US and from Europe to reconstruct. Another type of component which is badly missing are all the chemical components. And clearly when glues, resin, etc. are badly lacking as well to make basic part of an airplane. So all compounded, clearly we have several bottlenecks now that really slow down, I think it's a fact, slow down the manufacturing of airplanes. Last thing that I want to say is that both in the United States and in Europe, the lower part of the supply chain was badly hit. And at the beginning was not so bad, because when you decrease production, your need of cash is actually decreasing. When it started, but you've not made revenue and results for almost 2 years in a row, when you restart, you need cash to build your inventory and to restart, rehire, etc. And we see many level 2, level 3 supply chain stakeholders that are in great financial difficulty and that just can't buy the material they use to manufacture the part they are responsible for. So, and that's a more recent trend that we see, we've seen very badly at the end of the second part of 2022. So all compounded, indeed, there is a big problem. Do I see an improvement? Clearly in electronic components, with the downturn in some countries and the fact that we are all equipped and well equipped now, clearly the consumer electronics have slowed down. And we are seeing more resource coming back to the industry. I think it's felt by the automotive industry. We are seeing it in the aerospace industry, but still we have some very specific components that are still huge bottleneck worldwide, and badly enough, some of those are microprocessors that are used in our computer on board airplanes. So it's slowly improving. As far as the more basic material are concerned, it's really the switch of the supply chain, which is happening. Clearly investments are made, it is happening, but it will still take another year really to ease up. And last thing I wanted to say, it hit it first, the new airplane manufacturing. Now we are feeling it on the spare part. And the reason why we had a delay is that on the spare part, usually you have more inventory than what you have on production. Production is a flux, whereas spare part is not a continuous flux. And therefore you keep inventory because you don't master as well your demand. And as a consequence, you do keep a little bit of inventory on the spare part, which you don't have on the production side.
Okay. Well, I think Yehdef has explained it very well, but from a consumer perspective, as airlines, this is the challenge we're facing right now on spare parts. So whereas before, if you have an aircraft which is AOG, you get spare parts within hours, now we're talking about weeks and sometimes months. So this is becoming a huge challenge, and again, it goes back to affecting flight cancellations, reducing frequencies to where we were operating before, cancelling certain routes as well because you don't have enough aircraft. again, leading to the same problem of already the continent already being underserved. Now it's exacerbated even more. So I hope it'll be less than the year Yannick is talking about to resolve it, because it's a huge challenge for airlines across the world. Yeah.
We talk about technology. We get the picture very clearly. There's a global problem. We need a new generation to reform in the cockpit, in the industry, to create this new solution. And how could we form that? And we are at the end, we make a turn. I'd like to hear you. What is your point of view? And Claudia and Yore talk about girl. We need that because it's not only human resource. It's a new point of view, and we need a new point of view to get new solution. Maybe Marielle Ferry, because close to the GIMAS, there's a Formation Institute.
Alors, effectivement, le transport aérien, après la crise, a fait face à un problème planétaire de recrutement. C'était un peu inattendu, mais le chamboulement qu'il y a eu dans le transport aérien, au-delà de la supply chain, de tous les effets incroyables qu'il y a eu cette chose quand même qui a, avec le réchauffement climatique et ce sentiment d'urgence, il fallait que les jeunes puissent maintenant rêver. Ils avaient besoin de ce rêve, de travailler avec conviction. Et le réchauffement climatique a placé l'enjeu de la mobilité durable au cœur du changement technologique qui s'opérait. C'est une révolution technologique dans l'avion, dans les nouvelles mobilités. Et cette quête de sens a été apportée avec cette crise. Et nous, on voit au Maroc, on a un centre de formation qui va vraiment au cœur de cette problématique. Et cette envie des jeunes, cette motivation de travailler et d'être inscrit un petit peu dans cette dynamique internationale, parce que l'aéronautique est une filière qui a cet universalisme dans l'exigence qu'on ne trouve pas dans d'autres mobilités. Et ça, c'est exceptionnel. On le vit tous les jours. On a cette fascination, cette envie des jeunes en Afrique qui ont envie de s'intégrer dans cette filière mondiale et aux exigences très élevées. Et ça, pour nous, ça a été un reboost important, en tout cas, pour construire la filière d'avenir de l'aérospatiale.
Poppy, is the situation the same in South Africa?
Sorry, I didn't get the question.
Yeah, this new generation coming that get this dream.
So yes, I think this is a global issue. We've seen the brain drain as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. If you look at the profile of the aviation professionals, male-dominated, and the age is 55 and above, and the question is, what is it that you are doing to build this pipeline that is so needed? But I think in our view, or in my view, is that leadership is right at the center of, if we want to see change, it can't just be driven by the aspirations of the young ones. Somebody has to enable that change to happen. And I would like to challenge everyone who is in a position of leadership to really interrogate. I scanned around the room as we were sitting here and I said to myself, oh, okay. So this is really a reflection of how the industry looks. I'm sitting here in the front and I can scan the room, and it really is a testimony that we still need to change a lot to ensure that a young girl who is in a rural area somewhere, who has big dreams, through leadership gets enabled to pursue those dreams. And we've seen so many dreams dying, and that's because the leadership is not prioritizing the issues of diversity, the issues of ensuring that when we talk sustainability, continuity, we focus on the youth, because the youth is indeed the future of civil aviation. who perhaps no longer in a position where the age is no longer on my side, perhaps, but a 16-year-old who's dreaming, like what the lady, I apologize, I forgot her name, who was saying, I had a dream, but somebody enabled that dream. And quite often what I see is this reluctance of wanting to shift and make the pathway for the young ones to take over. To me, the young ones are not a threat, but they are a pipeline to ensure that there's continuity, there's sustainability of the industry, and if we don't pay attention to just those fundamentals, I think we are killing this industry slowly. At some point, we must shift out of the way and allow the youth, and particularly the women, deal with the unconscious biases, because some of them, they are really deep rooted in the culture of different regions, that you are a woman and therefore your place is this. And I think we need to really change and challenge ourselves of this mindset that, in my view, is backward thinking, and just look at things with different sets of eyes. You know, to say, at some point, we're going to have to shift aside. And if we shift, who's going to have to take over? And there is nobody else who can take over except for the young girls and the young boys who must rightfully, you know, make sure that this industry continues to thrive. So the next generation of aviation professionals, in my view, is, we should not even be having this discussion, because it should just be a natural succession. I don't want to be sitting in a position for 40 years. Shift, let the young ones take over, because they need to, you know, chart a new pathway. They're very creative, they're techno-savvy, they know things, they are aware. Social media brings so much awareness. But the big question is, are we ready as leaders of this generation to make it happen for the generation who is emerging?
So maybe one question again for
Even, you got an experience from the Rwanda, was a very resilient country, and your point of view is very important for us.
No, I am 100% in agreement with what Poppy has to say. And given the fact that, especially within the African continent, that in the next few years, by 2030, 42% of the global youth will be here in Africa, really, we should be focusing on that demographic to make sure that we upskill them and create space for them to take over from us. Really, it's fundamental. It has to be done. It's just logical.
Adefunke, to conclude.
Yes. So remember the girl who is doing her master's now in MIT? Well, it's the result of a dream, the dream of seeing a plane flying, and then she's like, oh, wow, I want to do that one day. And her dream will be realized, and she will become an aerospace engineer, one of the few women in that industry. So agree totally with what Poppy said, with what Yvonne said, and just to round it up by saying that, you know, that age issue that Poppy mentioned, where the industry's average age is in the late 50s, and the average age of Africa as a continent is 18 years old. So how are we going to bridge that gap, and how are we going to build, create the So at AFCAC, we're doing two things. We have set up the first ever Women in Aviation platform for the continent of Africa. And we put together a steering group from all the regions of Africa to be able to take that conversation forward. The purpose of that is to capacitate the women that are currently in the industry, who are in sort of middle management positions, and see how we can really help them and support them to get into senior roles, because the numbers at the top level are very low. That's why we had a round of applause that we had the first time ever that we're having an all-women panel, because there are very few of us. Okay, so we've got to move that up and change the number. But the other is the next generation, as she said, and we're going to be working with different organizations to see how we can really try to propel people to go into the industry. And we call on, you know, everyone here, everyone who is in the industry, maybe go back to your high school, your secondary school, your primary school, and go and do, you know, a talk for 15, 20 minutes on a careers day and say, this is where I work, this is what I do, and see how we can encourage these young people to come into the industry. They're waiting, and aviation can create so many jobs, so we all have a part to play. And finally, this is not a question of gender only, it's not about men versus women. Everyone has a role to play. The people who have supported me the most are men. So let us do our part and identify those young people, the young talents that you have, groom them and help them to develop and realize their potential.
Thank you so much, ladies. So you understand in this session that we speak a common language. It is a progress and the faith in humanity, in friendship. Thank you, ladies.
Okay. Now I have to jump down.
We are going to make a picture of this historic moment in Casablanca.